Hello everybody, my name is Tanya and welcome to my long overdue wrap up of the Classical Readalong. So the Classical Readalong was organised by Jean at Jean's Bookish Thoughts, and this was a readalong that was originally meant to take place in August of this year. It's now November. I finally finished the books in October, but I'm going to talk about it. So the first book that we read for the Classical Readalong was The Odyssey by Homer. Now this is something that I've been meaning to read for a really long time, both this and the Iliad. I'd actually intended on getting an audio version that was coming out I think in September. There's a new audio version that's just been released that's narrated by Dan Stevens of Downton Abbey fame, and he's got one of the best voices for narrating that I've ever heard. I listened to his narration of Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, the first James Bond novel, and it was so good. So I was eyeing those off thinking I'm going to get these and maybe listen to them in September. But then Jean announced the read-along and I went, I can't help but want to join in. So I ended up reading this. As I mentioned in my original read-along August video, I own two translations of this. I own both a prose translation, which is this one by Evie Ryu and revised by DCH Ryu, and I also own the verse translation by Robert Fagles. So I read a little bit from the start of each and found both really quite readable. I decided to go with this version because I knew that I had only a verse translation of the Metamorphosis, which we got to later in the month, so I decided I'd do the compare and contrast through the verse and the prose versions from these two. So I went with this one, and I really enjoyed this. This is the story of Odysseus, who has fought in the Trojan War and is now trying to get back home to Ithaca, and the adventures and misadventures that happen on the way. For all that I thought I knew the story of this, I found very quickly that the specifics, not so much. There was kind of a general impression, and some of the things that I thought were important in the story turned out to be only kind of mentioned in passing, or were only very small episodes in this bigger epic. So things like the sirens you hear about a lot, but that wasn't a very big scene in here. So at the beginning we get the setup of life at home. Odysseus' wife Penelope waiting for him to come home, and their son Telemachus, and the house is besieged by a whole bunch of suitors who want to marry Penelope because Odysseus has been gone for so long, and they're basically camping out and eating all her food and killing all her livestock and basically acting like complete assholes while she's trying to stay true to Odysseus and still hoping that maybe one day he will come back. The telling of this reminded me a bit of the style of the Thousand and One Nights, or the Arabian Nights, which I've been slowly working my way through, although I stalled months ago and haven't made any progress, but that's another story. It reminded me of that in that we get kind of one person's story and then they tell another story, and we kind of go back several layers and then back to the top again. So when we get to Odysseus, he is stranded on Calypso's island where he's been for several years, and it isn't until he gets off the island and is taken in by Alcinous that he then tells his story of what happened to him leading up to that point. And this is the part that I enjoyed the most, because we got the adventure part of his travels home. So this is where we get the sections of things like the Cyclops and the Sirens and stuff that we've all kind of heard of. And I found myself really liking Odysseus, despite the fact that his ego contributed to most of the misadventures that they had. So if he hadn't have had to crow, then the wrath of Poseidon wouldn't have come down on him, and that sparked all of the misfortunes that came after that. If he had just shut up, it would have been fine. So I like that section of adventure the best, when he then finally manages to get home to Ithaca, and we're getting the setup for when he is going to confront the suitors. Things slow down significantly, and we just kind of stroll towards the end of the book. But it was that middle kind of section I wanted to read, that adventure story, and that's the bit that I enjoyed the most. So then after reading The Odyssey, we read a modern adaptation, that was the Penelope by Margaret Atwood. And this is a retelling of The Odyssey, but from Penelope's perspective. So instead of being around and adventuring with Odysseus, we are at home with Penelope, waiting for this man to come home, and with all these suitors on her doorstep. Now I actually wanted to like Odysseus more than Margaret Atwood wanted me to. She very much focuses on his ego and his lying and paints him as more of a bad guy than the Odyssey does, and shows Penelope as a lot more aware and a lot more calculating. So instead of it being more of a love story of Odysseus trying to get home to Penelope, Penelope's like, yeah, God knows where he's been off for the last 10 years. And so it shows Penelope as being a lot more aware of what's going on and actually setting up things that happen when Odysseus gets back, instead of being completely blind to the fact that Odysseus is back. This was the fourth book that I've read by Margaret Atwood, and all of them have been incredibly different. I've read The Handmaid's Tale, The Blind Assassin, Alias Grace, and now The Penelope, and each of them have a very different style from one another. So I'm really intrigued to read more of Margaret Atwood's work and see whether she still continues to be very different in everything, or whether she's got a certain style that I can start to grasp as I read more. The second half of August was meant to be dedicated to Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I did start this in August, but I stalled. And the main reason I stalled, one, because I was trying to read War and Peace at the time, but two, because when I was trying to rush this, I found that my comprehension and my enjoyment was severely decreased, and I didn't want to just read this for the sake of reading it. I wanted to read it to enjoy it and to actually take it in. So I slowed things down, and that's why I didn't finish up with this one until October. So as I said in my read along August video, I'm not the biggest poetry reader, and when I read poetry I tend to tune out. So I was very interested to see how something of this length would go in poetry form, and I found it was fine. I read it fine. I quite enjoyed this translation. Basically I just read it as a normal prose version, and maybe I missed out on some of the canon and some of the effect of it being poetry by doing that, but it was the best way that I could actually take the information in. So unlike the Odyssey, the Metamorphoses is broken up into kind of shorter little stories and little tales within it, mainly all to do with some kind of metamorphosis. So either at the end the person may be changed into an animal or a tree, or something will happen to change something, and there's some kind of metamorphosis going on. There's a very different portrayal of the gods between Metamorphoses and the Odyssey. The Odyssey, we've got our main antagonist in Poseidon, but we've got Athena trying to help Odysseus, and we've got Zeus almost benevolently looking on. But when we get to the Metamorphoses, it's very much gods behaving badly. So we've got gods pursuing virginal maidens and exacting revenge on humans and other gods, whereas in the Odyssey they're a little bit more playful in their games that they play. The Metamorphoses, they seem to be a lot more spiteful and a lot more vicious in the meddling that they do. So there were a few stories that stood out in here. There were some things that I was familiar with from other stories, such as we get the story of King Midas and his golden touch, although I think the story changes a little bit from the kids' story of King Midas, but that's something that I recognised. There were some stories that were told in the Odyssey that were also told in the Metamorphoses, and there are also segments of the Odyssey that are in Metamorphoses. So we get some of Odysseus' story, we get some of the story that's covered in the Iliad earlier, which I found interesting. One of the stories that stuck with me the most was one where a man locks up his sister-in-law and abuses her and cuts out her tongue so she can't tell anybody, and when his wife finally finds out and frees her, they decide they're going to exact revenge on him. And so the way they decide they're going to revenge themselves on him is to kill her own child and cook him up and serve him to her husband. And so when he's there, you know, eating his stew or whatever, and, you know, saying, oh, where's such and such, where's the son? And they're like, ha, joke's on you, you just ate him. What? I don't think they thought that plan really through all that well. But anyway, so once I took a little bit more time to actually read the stories as an individual thing and to process everything a little bit more, I definitely really enjoyed the Metamorphoses, and I'm so pleased to have finally read it. And then the last book of the read-along was the modern adaptation of Metamorphoses, and that's Girl Meets Boy by Ali Smith. Now this is based on one particular myth from Metamorphoses, one particular story, and that is the myth of Iphis. Now the gist of the myth of Iphis is a woman is pregnant and her husband says, well, you better have a boy because if it's a girl we're going to have to kill it. And so she hopes and prays, and of course she gives birth to a girl, but the gods say no, it's going to be okay. So she is raised as a boy and dressed in boy's clothing, and everyone thinks she is a boy, given the name Iphis, which is a unisex kind of name, so it works out both ways. And time goes by and Iphis is betrothed to the daughter of their neighbour, who she's been raised alongside and is in love with, and all scandalous, it's a girl loving a girl. And so they're betrothed and they're going to get married, and she's distraught because she loves the girl, but the girl doesn't know that she's not a boy. And so the night before the wedding, the mother then goes and prays to the gods, and Iphis is miraculously transformed into a boy and everyone, it's a happy ending, and it's probably one of the only happy endings in Metamorphosis. Most of the time horrible stuff happens, somebody gets turned into an animal or a tree or something, and you kind of go, oh, okay. Whereas this one had a happy ever after because Iphis got to marry his love. So Ellie Smith takes that story with this one and gives it a modern retelling. So whereas the Penelopiad was a retelling from Penelope's perspective and was set in the same time period, Ellie Smith takes the myth of Iphis and brings it to a modern setting. So this is set in 2007 Scotland, which I found really interesting. And being the story that it is, she brings up kind of feminist elements and also just basic human rights elements in this, and I found it to be really, really interesting. So this is a tiny little book, but fits a lot into it. Basically, the premise is a young woman, Anthea, sees what she thinks is a young man up a ladder and, kind of spray painting a sign, and then realizes that, oh, this most beautiful boy that she's ever seen is actually the most beautiful girl she's ever seen. And so we get a lesbian romance, which was really well done actually, it was really nice. But Anthea's sister Midge has a bit more trouble accepting that. And I really enjoyed the sections that were narrated by Midge because we got her prejudices and her thoughts, and also the fact that she's striving to get this good career, whereas Anthea's just kind of not caring. And to see her shift in thinking as the book, slim as it is, goes on, is really nice to watch, and I really enjoyed those sections a lot. So as I said, this turns into a more feminist perspective and female rights. So there were some statistics in here that are taken from Womankind, which is a UK charity whose raison d'etre is to provide voice, aid and rights to disempowered women worldwide. So there are some horrifying stats like, across the world, 2 million girls killed before birth or at birth because they weren't boys. That's on record. Add to that the off-record estimate of 58 million more girls killed because they weren't boys. That's 60 million girls. And this is from 2007, these statistics. It's quite frightening. And all in all, I really, really enjoyed this book and would definitely recommend it. Both the Penelopiad and Girl Meets Boy are part of the Canongate Myth series, which is a whole series of myths that have been given modern adaptations. And I really enjoyed the both of these, so I'm intrigued to look into those at some point in time. Possibly reading them alongside the source material like I have with these ones. They're only small little books and definitely worth a read. I'll leave a link to the Goodreads group that was a discussion for the Classical Readalong. Unfortunately, there wasn't all that many people talking there, and now that it's so far behind, I don't know that there is going to be any more discussion. I've not contributed anything and I'm feeling really bad about that, but I was kind of so behindhand that it didn't happen. But I'm really pleased that I did join the read along, for all that it hasn't been such a vocal one. I'm so pleased for the push to finally pick up and enjoy some classical literature. I'll leave links to Jean's channel down below, and thank you, Jean, for organising the read along because I got a lot out of it, even if there wasn't a lot of conversation with others. As always, thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!